They found him holding her dress torn by the river's teeth, his hands stained with mud and rain, and by sunrise 50 Apache warriors would come riding for his life. The storm had come down hard that evening, the kind that bent trees and swallowed sound, turning the canyon into a roaring throat of water and wind, and Ethan Cole should have been heading back to his cabin like any man with sense left in him, but sense had never been the thing that kept him alive out here. It was something quieter, something heavier, the kind that made a man stop when he heard a cry that didn't belong to the land. He heard it once, sharp and breaking through the thunder, and that was enough. His horse fought him as he turned toward the sound, hooves slipping on wet stone, rain cutting sideways across his face like fine gravel, but Ethan pressed on, guiding the animal down toward the river that had swelled beyond its banks, churning fast and dark under a sky that had forgotten light. That's where he saw her, caught in the current near a cluster of broken branches, her body twisting with the pull of the water, long black hair clinging to her face, her hands reaching for something that wasn't there. For a second, just a second, Ethan stood still, the world narrowing to that image, because he knew what she was the moment he saw the cut of her clothing, the pattern stitched along the edge, Apache, and out here that meant trouble in ways that didn't need explaining. But the river didn't care about names or tribes, and neither did death, so he moved. He swung down from the saddle and stepped into the water without thinking twice, the cold hitting him like a wall, boots slipping as the current grabbed at his legs, trying to take him the same way it was taking her, and he pushed through it, one step at a time, until he reached her just as her strength gave out. Her eyes met his for a breath, dark and sharp even through the storm, and there was no gratitude there, no relief, just something tight and guarded, something that made him hesitate for the first time. But the river surged again, and that hesitation could have cost them both. So he grabbed her, pulling her toward him. One arm braced around her back as he fought to turn them toward the bank. The fabric of her dress bunched in his hand, heavy with water, dragging her down, and when he pulled harder, it gave with a sharp tear that cut through the sound of the storm, the cloth ripping under the strain as he hauled her forward. He didn't think about it then, didn't think about what that tearing meant, only that they were moving, inch by inch, toward the mud and rock that marked the edge of the river. By the time he dragged her onto solid ground, both of them were breathing hard, the storm still raging around them, rain hammering against the earth, turning everything slick and uncertain. He let go of her slowly, stepping back, hands raised just enough to show he meant no harm, but she scrambled away from him anyway, clutching what remained of her dress to her chest, her eyes wide now, not with fear of the river, but of him. Ethan felt something shift then, something colder than the water, because he understood enough to know what she saw, a white man standing over her, her clothing torn, her body marked by struggle, and out here that picture didn't need words to become a verdict. "I pulled you out," he said, voice low, steady, though the wind tried to carry it away, but she shook her head slightly, as if the truth didn't matter, as if the story had already been written the moment that fabric tore. She looked past him then, toward the ridge above the river, her body going still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and Ethan followed her gaze, though all he saw at first was shadow and rain. Then he heard it, faint under the storm, a distant call carried on the wind, not loud, not rushed, but certain, and something in the sound made the back of his neck tighten. He looked back at her, and she spoke, her English careful, strained, each word placed like it cost her something. "If they find me here," she said, her grip tightening on the torn fabric, "they will not ask what happened." The storm cracked overhead, lightning splitting the sky for a heartbeat, and in that flash Ethan saw it clear, the truth settling in his chest like a weight that wasn't going anywhere. "They will kill you first," she finished, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the river roaring behind them, the wind pushing at their backs, and somewhere out beyond the rain, riders were already on their way. The rain did not let up, not the kind that fades into a quiet drizzle, but the kind that stays heavy, steady, like the sky has decided something needs to be washed clean, and Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of her words settling deeper than the cold ever could, because he believed her, not from fear, not from stories told in saloons, but from the way she said it, like a fact already written in stone. He glanced once toward the ridge again, the shape of the land barely visible through the curtain of water, then back to her, still crouched low, arms wrapped tight around herself, holding what was left of that torn fabric as if it could shield her from more than the storm. "Can you stand?" he asked, voice even, giving her space the way a man does around something wounded and proud at the same time, and she hesitated, not because she could not, but because trusting him even that much felt like stepping onto ground that might give way beneath her. Still, she pushed herself up, slow and careful, her balance unsteady but her eyes never leaving his, measuring, weighing, deciding in silence what kind of man stood in front of her. The wind shifted then, carrying something new, not a sound, not yet, but a feeling, the kind that settles in the gut before it reaches the ears, and Ethan made his choice the same way he always did, without ceremony, without asking if it would cost him later. "My place is about half a mile west," he said, nodding toward a line of dark trees barely visible through the storm. "You stay out here. The river will finish what it started." She did not answer right away, her gaze flicking once more toward the ridge, then back to him. And for a moment he thought she would turn and run into the storm alone, disappear into it like she had never been there at all, but instead she took one step toward him, then another, slow, controlled, not surrendering, just choosing the path that gave her a chance to keep breathing. They moved together after that, not close, not far, a careful distance between them that spoke louder than any words, Ethan leading his horse by the reins, letting the animal pick its way over slick ground while he kept his pace matched to hers, watching without making it obvious every time she faltered. The land rose gradually as they left the river behind, the sound of rushing water fading into the steady drum of rain against dirt and brush, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of their steps, the pull of the wind, the faint creak of saddle leather. She stumbled once on a loose rock, catching herself before he could reach out, and he stopped anyway, waiting, giving her the choice again, and she straightened, jaw tight, shaking her head just enough to say she did not need his hand. "You should have left me," she said finally, her voice quieter now but no less certain, and Ethan let out a slow breath, not looking back at her as he answered. "Maybe," he said, "but I did not." That was all he offered, no explanation, no apology, because out here words did not change what had already been done. The trees thickened as they approached the edge of his land, tall pines bending under the weight of the storm, their branches catching the worst of the wind, and beyond them the outline of his cabin came into view, small, weathered, standing alone against years of weather and silence. It was not much, just 4 walls, a porch that leaned a little to the left, a corral that had seen better days, but it had held him together long enough, and tonight it would have to hold one more. He led the horse under the overhang and tied it off quick, movements practiced and efficient, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the door without getting too close. "Inside," he said, and she paused again at the threshold, looking at the cabin like it was another kind of risk entirely, something enclosed, something that could trap as easily as it could protect. The storm cracked again overhead, a sharp burst of thunder that rolled across the hills, and that decided it for her. She stepped in. The inside smelled of wood smoke and leather, faint and familiar, the kind of place built for survival, not comfort, and Ethan followed a second later, closing the door against the wind, shutting out the storm but not the tension that had come in with them. He moved first, crossing to the small table near the wall, lighting a lantern with steady hands, the flame flickering to life and casting a low, warm glow across the room, and for the first time he could see her clearly without rain between them. Mud streaked her arms, her hair clung damp against her shoulders, and the tear in her dress was worse up close. The fabric pulled and frayed where the river had taken its share, and her grip on it tightened when she noticed his gaze. He looked away immediately, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, turning his attention to the shelf where he kept what little he had for injuries, cloth, clean water, a small tin of salve that had lasted him through more than one hard winter. "Sit," he said, setting the items down within her reach rather than bringing them to her, letting her decide how close he could come, and she did not move at first, standing there in the lantern light, breathing steady now, watching him the way a person watches a fire, aware it can warm or burn depending on how close you get. Then, slowly, She crossed the room and lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, every motion deliberate, controlled, and when she finally looked up at him again, there was still caution in her eyes, still distance, but something else had slipped in beside it, something quieter, harder to name. Not trust. Not yet. But the absence of immediate fear, and out here, on a night like this, that was more than most men ever earned. The lantern light settled low and steady, casting long shadows along the wooden walls, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence thick but not empty, filled instead with the quiet work of breathing, of deciding what came next in a place where choices never stayed small for long. Ethan leaned against the far side of the table, giving her space not just in distance but in presence, his hands resting flat against the worn wood, waiting without pressing, because he knew enough to understand that rushing a moment like this only broke it. Nayeli sat still, her shoulders squared despite the fatigue that showed in the slight tremble of her arms, and after a moment she reached for the cloth he had placed within her reach, dipping it into the water with slow, careful movements. She did not look at him while she worked, her focus fixed on what needed to be done, cleaning away the river mud, pressing the cloth where the current had scraped and pulled, every motion deliberate, controlled, as if control itself was the only thing keeping the world from slipping further out of place. Ethan watched without staring, noting the way she refused to show weakness even when it cost her, the way her jaw tightened when the cold water touched raw skin, and something about that felt familiar in a way he did not like to examine too closely. Outside, the storm shifted again, not weaker, just different, the wind turning direction, the rain striking the cabin walls at a sharper angle, and beneath it, faint but there, came a sound that did not belong to weather, a distant rhythm carried just at the edge of hearing. Ethan's head tilted slightly, listening, his eyes moving toward the door without fully turning his body, and Nayeli noticed, her hands pausing mid-motion as she watched him instead of her own work. "You hear it," she said, not a question, and Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "Yeah," he answered, simple, certain. The sound came again, low and spaced out, not rushed, not searching, but steady, like men who already knew where they were going and how long it would take to get there. Nayeli set the cloth down then, her fingers curling briefly against her palm before relaxing again, and for the first time since they had stepped inside, something like resignation flickered across her face. "They are not far," she said quietly, her voice losing none of its strength, but carrying something heavier now, something that spoke of understanding the path ahead even if she did not accept it. Ethan pushed himself off the table, moving to the small shelf near the door, not in panic, not in haste, just with purpose, his hands finding what they always found when the world outside started closing in. A canteen, a length of rope, a folded blanket, small things that made a difference when the difference mattered. He set them down one by one, not looking at her as he spoke. "Then we do not wait for them to get here," he said, and that made her look up sharply, surprise cutting through the guarded calm in her eyes. "There is nowhere to go," she replied, almost immediately, as if the idea itself was something that had already been considered and dismissed long before this moment. "They know this land better than you." Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing once toward the window where the storm blurred everything beyond the glass into shadow and movement. "Maybe," he said, "but I know it enough." He turned then, meeting her gaze fully, and there was no challenge in his expression, no stubborn pride, just a quiet certainty that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "Staying here puts you in their hands," he continued. "Leaving at least gives us a say in what happens next." The words hung between them, simple, plain, but carrying weight all the same, and Nayeli studied him in silence, her eyes searching for something behind what he said, something that might explain why he would take that kind of risk for someone who had brought nothing but trouble to his door. "Why?" she asked finally, the words soft but sharp, cutting through everything else in the room. Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze drifting for a second, not away from her, but inward, towards something older, something that had shaped him long before this night had ever begun. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less steady. "Because leaving someone behind when you could have helped them," he said, "does not sit right with me." It was not a speech, not a justification, just a fact stated the same way he might talk about the weather or the land, and for a moment Nayeli said nothing, her expression unreadable, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, as if something inside her had shifted without her permission. Outside, the distant rhythm grew clearer, still far, but closing the space between where it was and where it would soon be, and the cabin seemed smaller for it. The walls holding in the light, but not the inevitability that pressed in from beyond them. Nayeli reached up then, her fingers brushing against something at her neck, and Ethan's eyes caught the movement without meaning to, noticing the thin cord that had been hidden beneath her hair, the small pendant resting there, dull in the low light but unmistakable in shape, a piece of turquoise wrapped in simple metal, worn smooth with time. Something about it pulled at his memory, not clear, not complete, just a flicker of recognition that settled in the back of his mind and refused to fade. Nayeli followed his gaze and stilled, her hand closing over the pendant instinctively, guarding it without thinking, and Ethan looked away just as quickly, as if he had seen something he was not meant to see. The moment passed, but it left something behind, something quiet and unresolved, and outside the storm kept moving, the sound of it blending now with that distant, steady rhythm, both of them drawing closer with every passing second. The sound outside grew steadier, no longer something imagined between thunder and wind, but a pattern that held its shape, slow and deliberate, like footsteps that did not need to hurry, and Ethan knew then that whatever time they had left was measured in minutes, not guesses. He moved without urgency but without hesitation, crossing the room to the far wall where a worn map was pinned beneath a rusted nail, edges curled from years of heat and cold, and he studied it for a brief moment, not because he needed to read it, but because seeing it grounded the path in something real. "There is a ridge line about a quarter-mile north," he said, his voice low but clear, tracing an invisible line in the air with his finger. "Steep, narrow, hard to ride through in weather like this, but it cuts west after about half a mile and opens into a dry stretch they cannot track easy in the rain." Nayeli listened without interrupting, her posture still guarded, but her eyes following the direction he marked as if she could see the land through the walls. "They will split," she said after a moment, her tone steady, analytical. "Some will follow the river, some will take higher ground. They do not chase blindly." Ethan gave a small nod, not surprised, adjusting his thinking without resistance. "Then we do not run like we are being chased," he replied. "We move like we belong there." The idea settled between them, not comfortable, but possible, and for the first time since she had stepped into the cabin, Nayeli did not dismiss what he said outright. The rhythm outside came again, closer now, clearer, no longer lost in the storm, and she rose from the chair in one smooth motion, her earlier weakness tucked away behind something stronger, something shaped by years of knowing exactly what it meant to be hunted and how to survive it. She reached for the blanket he had set down and wrapped it around her shoulders, not for warmth, but to conceal, to change the outline of who she was in the dark, and Ethan watched the movement with quiet understanding, recognizing the instinct even if he had learned it in a different way. He moved to the door then, resting his hand against the wood for a brief second, feeling the vibration of the storm through it, the world pressing in from the other side, and he turned back to her once more. "When we step out," he said, "we do not speak unless we have to, and if we get separated, you head west, do not wait." Nayeli held his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she gave a slight nod, accepting the terms not as orders, but as a shared understanding. "And you," she said quietly, "do not try to stand between me and them." There was no accusation in her voice, just a statement of reality, and Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was honest in a way most things were not. "Not planning to," he answered, though something in his tone suggested that plans had a way of changing when the moment demanded it. The lantern flickered as a stronger gust of wind hit the cabin, the light shifting across their faces, and for a brief second the small space felt even smaller, holding two lives balanced on a decision that could not be taken back. Nayeli's hand moved again to the pendant at her neck, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface as if grounding herself in. something older than fear, and Ethan noticed it again, that faint pull in his memory tightening just a little, not enough to understand, but enough to matter. That, he said before he could stop himself, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. I have seen one like it. Her hand stilled instantly, her eyes locking onto his with a sharpness that cut through everything else, and the distance between them shifted, not closing, but changing shape. Where? She asked, the single word carrying more weight than any question had a right to. Ethan hesitated, not because he did not want to answer, but because the memory itself came slow, like something buried under years of dust and silence, and when it surfaced, it did not come alone. A long time ago, he said, choosing his words carefully. My mother had one. Same stone, same wrap. She said it was given to her by someone who found her when she had no one else. The room went still around that, the storm outside fading for a moment into something distant, and Nayeli's expression changed in a way that was small but undeniable, the hardness in her gaze softening just enough to let something else through. My grandmother made these, she said after a breath, her voice quieter now, carrying something that was not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but close to both. She gave them only to those she believed would carry them with honor. The words settled between them, heavy and fragile at the same time, and Ethan felt that pull in his chest tighten into something clearer, something that connected this moment to one he had not thought about in years. Outside, the rhythm came again, closer now, undeniable, the storm no longer able to hide it, and the world snapped back into place with the reminder of what was coming. Ethan's hand moved from the door latch, gripping it firm, and he gave her one last look, not searching, not questioning, just seeing her for what she was in that moment. Not a stranger, not a problem, but something that had stepped into his life and changed its direction without asking permission. Ready, he said, and Nayeli gave a single nod, her shoulders squared, her hand falling away from the pendant as she prepared to step back into the storm, into whatever waited beyond it, and this time, when Ethan opened the door, neither of them hesitated. The door swung open and the storm rushed in like it had been waiting, cold rain striking their faces, wind pressing against their bodies as if trying to push them back inside, but neither of them stepped away from it. Not now, not when stepping forward was the only thing left. Ethan moved first, pulling his hat lower, guiding his horse with a firm hand as he stepped into the dark, his boots finding the ground by instinct more than sight, and behind him Nayeli followed without a word, her movements quieter, lighter, but just as certain. The world outside had lost its edges, everything blurred into shadow and motion, the land reduced to shapes and memory, and Ethan did not look back to see if she was still there. He trusted that she was, the same way she trusted he would not lead her straight into danger without reason. They kept low as they moved past the corral, keeping close to the line of trees where the wind broke just enough to make breathing easier, and for a while the only sound was the storm itself, heavy and constant, masking everything else. Then it came again, that rhythm, clearer now, closer, no longer something carried by chance, but something deliberate, and Ethan slowed just slightly, adjusting their path without speaking, angling them away from the open ground and toward the rise he had mentioned inside. Nayeli caught the shift immediately, matching it without hesitation, her awareness stretching beyond what the eyes could see, reading the land the way others read words. They climbed gradually, the incline steady, the mud pulling at their boots, the trees thinning as they gained height, and when Ethan finally paused, it was not to rest, but to listen. The storm had changed again, not weaker, but broken in places, the wind shifting enough to let other sounds through, and in that brief opening they both heard it, not far now, the faint echo of horses moving with purpose, steady, controlled, not rushing, because they did not need to. Nayeli's breath slowed, not from exhaustion, but from focus, her eyes scanning the dark ridge ahead, calculating distances, choices, consequences, and when she spoke, it was barely above the wind. They know we left, she said. Not fear, not panic, just fact. Ethan nodded once, his jaw set, his gaze fixed forward. Then we stay ahead, he replied, simple, because anything more would not change what was coming. He started forward again, pushing them along the narrow path that cut across the ridge, the ground firmer here, the rain running off instead of pooling, and for a moment the world felt almost still, suspended between what had happened and what would happen next. Nayeli moved closer now, not by much, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier, more like a shared line they both walked, and when her foot slipped slightly on a patch of loose stone, Ethan reached out without thinking, his hand catching her arm just long enough to steady her before pulling back immediately.
She did not flinch this time. She did not pull away.
She simply nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement that said more than words could carry. The ridge bent west just as Ethan had said, opening into a stretch of land where the rain flattened everything into one shifting surface. No clear tracks, no easy signs to follow, and he slowed again, turning to her just enough that she could see his face beneath the brim of his hat. "This is where we change," he said, his voice low, steady. "We do not run straight. We move like we are not hiding." Nayeli studied him for a brief second, then gave a slight nod, understanding settling in, and together they stepped forward into the open, not as two people fleeing, but as two figures moving through the storm with purpose, the kind of movement that did not invite pursuit because it did not look like fear. Behind them, the rhythm of riders continued, closer now, pressing into the space they had just left, but for the first time since the river, the distance between hunter and hunted did not feel fixed. It felt like something that could shift, something that depended not just on speed, but on the choices made in moments like this, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to take back. The open stretch swallowed them whole, the rain flattening the ground into a shifting gray sheet where every step disappeared almost as soon as it was made, and for a few breaths it felt like the land itself had chosen not to remember them, like it had decided to give them a chance it did not owe. Ethan kept his pace steady, not too fast, not too slow, his shoulders relaxed in a way that looked almost careless from a distance, and Nayeli matched it beside him, her posture straight, her steps measured, as if she had walked this exact path 100 times before even though she had not. The storm pressed down from above, wind dragging at the blanket around her shoulders, rain running along the brim of his hat and dripping from his jaw, and still they moved forward, as if the world behind them did not exist. But it did. The sound came again, closer now, not just a rhythm but the shape of movement behind it, horses covering ground with confidence, riders who did not hesitate because hesitation was not part of how they lived. Nayeli's eyes shifted slightly, not turning her head, just enough to catch the edge of what followed them, and her voice came low, carried between breaths. "They are spreading," she said, the words precise, controlled, not chasing one line. Ethan gave a slight nod, already adjusting, his gaze moving ahead to where the open stretch began to break into scattered rock and low brush. "Then we give them more lines to read," he replied, his tone unchanged, as if he were speaking about something simple, something ordinary, even though nothing about this moment was. He angled their path just a fraction, subtle enough that it did not look like a turn, leading them toward a patch of uneven ground where the rain collected in shallow pools, reflections shifting with every drop, blurring shape and depth. Nayeli followed without question, understanding the intent without needing it explained, and as they stepped through that ground, their movements slowed slightly, careful, deliberate, each step placed where the water would break the outline, where the land would hold less of them. The wind eased for a moment, just long enough to let the world breathe, and in that breath the distance behind them closed again, the presence of others no longer hidden, just out of sight but unmistakable in its weight. Ethan stopped then, sudden but controlled, turning just enough to take in the line of the ridge they had crossed, the faint shapes moving along it like shadows given purpose, and he looked back to Nayeli, his expression steady. "We split here," he said, the words landing without force but carrying finality. Her eyes met his instantly, sharp, questioning, and for the first time since they had left the cabin, something close to resistance flickered there. "No," she said, quiet but firm. "They will expect that." Ethan held her gaze, not arguing, just waiting, and after a second, he shook his head slightly. "They expect us to stay together because it is safer," he answered. "So we do the opposite, not far, just enough to break what they see. The storm picked up again, rain striking harder, wind rising, and for a moment the world seemed to lean into the decision, pressing it forward. Nayeli's jaw tightened, her hand brushing once more against the pendant at her neck, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, carrying something beneath the words that had not been there before. "If we do this," she said, "we may not find each other again." Ethan did not look away, did not soften what came next. "Then you keep moving west," he said, "and you do not look back." The silence that followed was brief, but it held more than anything spoken, a space where choice became something real, something that would shape everything after. Nayeli studied him for a long second, as if measuring not just the plan, but the man who had made it, and then she gave a single nod, small but certain. "You too," she replied, and it was not an instruction, not a command, just a shared understanding that whatever path they took from here would not belong to either of them alone. Ethan stepped back then, just enough to create the space between them again, not the distance from before, but something different, something that carried weight now, and without another word, they turned in opposite directions, moving into the storm on separate lines that cut across the land like quiet decisions, each step taking them further apart even as the sound behind them continued to close in. The distance between them stretched quickly once they parted, not because they ran, but because the storm swallowed everything that did not hold tight to itself, and within a dozen steps Ethan could no longer hear her movement behind him, only the wind and the rain, and the faint echo of riders cutting through the dark somewhere off his right side. He did not look back. Not once. Because looking back meant hesitation, and hesitation was something the land punished without warning. Instead, he kept moving west as planned, angling his path across uneven ground where the rocks broke the surface in jagged lines, forcing his steps into a rhythm that looked natural but made tracking harder for anyone following at speed. The rain helped, washing away edges, softening impressions, turning every footprint into something less certain, but Ethan knew better than to trust the storm alone. Men who lived by the land learned to read more than what was left behind. They read what was missing. He slowed slightly, just enough to change the pattern of his stride, then shifted again, circling a shallow dip in the terrain before climbing out along a different angle, layering confusion into his trail without breaking the illusion of direction. Behind him, the sound of horses drew closer, then split, just as Nayeli had said they would, the rhythm dividing into separate lines that fanned across the land with purpose. They were not searching blindly. They were closing in. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his hand brushing once against the side of his horse as he guided it through a narrow gap between two low rock formations, the animal moving with quiet obedience, trained enough to follow without noise. The wind shifted again, carrying a brief break in the storm, and in that moment of clearer air, Ethan caught sight of movement along the ridge to his right, dark shapes cutting across the skyline, riders silhouetted against the faint glow of lightning far off in the distance. He stopped for a fraction of a second, just enough to measure, to judge the space between them, and then he moved again, this time angling slightly lower, letting the land swallow his outline instead of leaving it exposed. The ground dipped into a shallow wash, dry beneath the surface despite the rain, the kind of place water passed through but did not settle, and Ethan guided his horse down into it, boots hitting firmer ground as he stepped off the slope. For a moment, the world felt quieter there, the walls of the wash breaking the wind just enough to dull its edge, and he paused, listening, counting the beats between what he could hear and what he could not. The riders above moved past the ridge line, their path cutting across where he had been minutes earlier, and for a brief moment, the distance between hunter and hunted stretched just enough to breathe. Ethan did not waste it. He moved again, following the line of the wash west, keeping low, letting the terrain do what it was built to do, hide what did not want to be seen. But even as he moved forward, something pulled at him. Not fear, not doubt, but something quieter, something that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the space he had left behind.
Nayeli.
He pushed the thought aside at first, focusing on the path, the sound, the rhythm of his own movement, but it did not fade. It stayed there, steady, persistent, like the echo of something unfinished. He slowed again, just slightly, his jaw tightening as the decision formed without asking for permission. Splitting had been the right move. It had given them both a chance. But chance was not certainty. And out here, certainty was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The wind rose again, louder now, carrying the sound of distant movement in more than one direction, and Ethan stopped completely this time, turning his head just enough to listen past the storm, past the noise, searching for something specific, something he could not name but would recognize if he heard it. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faint and almost lost beneath the wind, a sound reached him, not the steady rhythm of riders, not the shifting of the storm, but something else, something softer, uneven, like movement that did not belong to a horse or a man who felt safe. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to decide. Then he turned, not west, back toward where they had split. The storm swallowed his change in direction as easily as it had swallowed everything else, and within seconds his path was gone, erased like it had never been there, but the choice remained, clear and unshaken, as he moved into the dark with a purpose that had nothing to do with escape anymore. The storm shifted as he turned back, not easing, not softening, but changing direction just enough to press harder against his face, as if the land itself was questioning his choice, asking whether a man who had already found a way out would truly walk back into the same danger he had just escaped. Ethan did not answer it. He moved fast now, not running, but cutting across the terrain with a purpose that no longer needed to be hidden, his boots finding the line he had memorized minutes before, his eyes scanning the dark for anything that broke the pattern of rain and stone. The wash he had used to disappear fell behind him quickly, replaced by rising ground that pulled at his legs, the mud heavier here, the rocks slick underfoot, and still he pushed forward, listening between the wind, searching for that uneven sound he had caught before. It came again, faint but clearer now, a shift in movement that did not match the rhythm of riders, something lower, closer to the ground, and his jaw tightened as the distance closed. Naeli was not running blindly. She would not. But something had slowed her. Something had forced her off the line they had planned. Ethan crested a small rise and dropped low immediately, his body instinctively folding into the shape of the land as he scanned ahead, and there, just beyond a cluster of broken brush, he saw her. She was moving, but not with the same steady control as before, her steps uneven, one side of her body held tighter than the other, the storm pressing against her as she tried to keep her direction without leaving too clear a path. For a moment, Ethan stayed where he was, watching, measuring the space, the timing, the distance between her and the shadows moving across the higher ridge behind her. And it was enough to know that if she kept going alone, that distance would not hold. He moved then, angling down toward her, not directly, not in a straight line, but cutting across her path so that when she saw him, he would already be where she needed to go next. She noticed him at the last second, her body shifting instantly, not in fear, but in readiness, her stance tightening as if she expected something else entirely, and when recognition replaced that tension, it did not bring relief, it brought something sharper. "You should have kept going," she said, her voice low but edged with something that was not quite anger, not quite frustration, but close to both. Ethan did not slow as he reached her, his eyes already moving past her position to the terrain ahead. "You are not moving fast enough," he replied, just as direct, his tone leaving no space for argument, and for a brief second, her gaze held his, something unspoken passing between them, something that acknowledged the truth in both of their choices. Then the sound came again, closer now, the rhythm of riders tightening its circle, and the moment ended. Ethan reached for the blanket at her shoulders, not pulling it away, but adjusting it, wrapping it tighter to keep it from catching in the wind, his movements quick, practical, and this time she did not resist. She did not step back. She let him. "There is a cut through the rocks ahead," he said, nodding toward a darker line barely visible through the storm, narrow enough that they cannot ride through it side by side. "We use that." Naeli glanced once in that direction, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the shape of the land through the rain, and then she nodded, her breath steady despite the strain showing at the edges of her movement. They moved together again without another word, the distance between them gone now, replaced by a shared line of motion that carried both urgency and control. The ground tightened as they approached the rock formation, the space narrowing, forcing them closer, the walls rising just enough to break the wind and hold the sound, and behind them the riders shifted again, their movement adjusting to the change in terrain, their presence no longer distant but closing. Ethan did not look back this time. He did not need to. He could feel it in the air, in the way the storm bent around them, in the way the land seemed to draw tight. As they reached the entrance to the narrow cut, Nayeli's hand brushed once more against the pendant at her neck, a brief, instinctive motion, and Ethan caught it again, that small flash of turquoise in the dim light, and something in his chest settled, not easing, not calming, but locking into place with a certainty that had nothing to do with the path ahead and everything to do with the reason he had turned back. They stepped into the narrow passage together, the rock walls rising on either side, the storm fading just enough to leave only the sound of their breathing and the distant, steady rhythm that still followed, and for the first time since the river, the world felt close enough to hold its breath. The narrow passage closed around them like a held breath, the rock walls rising on both sides just wide enough for a single rider, just tight enough to force every step into intention, and as soon as they stepped inside, the storm lost its voice, reduced to a distant echo that pressed faintly against the stone. Ethan slowed, not stopping, but letting the pace settle into something quieter, something that matched the space they had entered, and Nayeli moved beside him, her breathing controlled but heavier now, the strain no longer hidden beneath steady movement. The ground beneath their boots shifted from mud to packed earth, firmer, less forgiving, and every step carried a sound that could not be erased by rain, only absorbed by distance. Behind them, the rhythm of riders reached the mouth of the passage, not entering yet, but close enough that the presence felt immediate, like a weight pressing just beyond sight. Nayeli glanced back once, just enough to measure, then forward again, her voice low, almost a whisper shaped by caution rather than fear. "They will not rush this," she said, her tone certain. "They will wait. Listen. Let us show them where we go." Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze fixed ahead where the passage curved gently out of sight, the darkness there deeper, thicker, like something waiting. "Then we do not give them sound," he replied, lowering his steps further, placing each foot with care, guiding his horse with a hand that barely touched the reins. The animal followed without protest, trained by years of quiet work, its breath slow, controlled, blending into the stillness of the rock. They moved like that for several yards, maybe 30, maybe 40, time losing its edge in the confined space, until the passage bent just enough to break the line of sight from the entrance, and Ethan stopped. Not abruptly, deliberately. He turned his head slightly, listening, counting the silence behind them, and for a moment there was nothing, no movement, no sound beyond the faint whisper of wind slipping through the stone. Nayeli watched him, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that lingered beneath them, and she understood before he spoke. "They are waiting," she said, and it was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "And they will follow slow," he added, "one at a time, careful, no mistakes." The weight of that settled in the narrow space, not heavy, but precise, like a line drawn between what could still be avoided and what could not. Nayeli's hand moved again to the pendant at her neck, her fingers pressing briefly against it as if drawing something from its presence, and when she looked at him this time, there was something different in her gaze, something that had not been there before. Not just awareness, not just calculation, something closer to trust, though it still carried edges. "There is another way," she said quietly, nodding toward the darker curve ahead, a split in the rock, narrow, easy to miss if you do not know it is there. Ethan studied her for a moment, weighing the words, not questioning her knowledge, but understanding what it meant to take a path he had not seen himself. "You lead," he said simply, and for a brief second, something softened to her expression, something small, but real. She turned without another word, moving forward with renewed focus, her steps more certain now, her body adjusting to the terrain in a way that spoke of familiarity, even here, even in a place that seemed to belong only to stone and shadow. The passage narrowed further as they moved, the walls pressing closer, forcing them into single file. Ethan just behind her now, his presence no longer guiding, but supporting, and the sound behind them shifted again. Faint but unmistakable, a single rider entering the passage, slow, deliberate, careful not to disturb what could not be seen. Nayeli did not look back.
She did not need to.
She reached out with one hand, brushing along the rock face until her fingers found a seam barely visible in the dim light, a break in the stone that did not look like a path until it was one. "Here," she whispered, stepping into the narrow opening, her body turning sideways to pass through, the space tight, forcing closeness, forcing trust, and Ethan followed without hesitation, guiding his horse through with quiet precision. As they slipped into the hidden cut, the main passage fell behind them, the sound of the rider continuing forward, unaware, committed to the path they had just abandoned, and for the first time since the chase began, the distance between them and those who followed did not just stretch, it shifted completely, breaking into something uncertain, something that could not be easily corrected. The hidden path curved sharply, dropping slightly, the air cooler, the silence deeper, and as they moved further into it, the world beyond the stone felt farther away, not gone, but separated by more than just distance. Nayeli slowed then, just enough to let Ethan come level with her, and without looking at him, she spoke, her voice barely more than breath. "You came back," she said, not asking, not accusing, just stating what had happened. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes scanning the path ahead, his mind still tracking the space behind them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, unchanged. "You are not finished walking," he said, and for a moment, in that narrow space between stone and silence, the words settled into something that neither of them tried to explain. The hidden path narrowed even further before it opened, not into space, but into a hollow carved by time and water, a quiet basin sheltered beneath the weight of stone where the storm could not fully reach, where the wind softened into a low breath and the rain became a distant murmur instead of a force pressing against the body. Nayeli stepped into it first and slowed, her shoulders lowering just slightly as if the land itself had given her permission to take one full breath without looking over it. Ethan followed close behind, guiding the horse into the space and letting the reins fall loose. Once they were clear of the narrow cut, his eyes moving not with urgency now, but with care, reading the edges, the shadows, the places where sound might carry or stop. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence here was different, not empty, not tense, but held, like something waiting to be acknowledged. The sound of the rider in the main passage faded, swallowed by distance and stone, and the chase that had pressed so close only minutes ago seemed to pause just beyond reach. Nayeli moved to the far side of the hollow and rested her hand against the rock, steadying herself not from fear, but from the quiet weight of everything that had led them here. Ethan watched her for a second, noticing the way she favored one step just slightly, the way her strength held but did not hide the cost beneath it, and without a word he reached for the canteen at his side and held it out, not offering, not insisting, just placing it within her reach the same way he had before. She looked at it, then at him, and this time she did not hesitate. She took it. The movement was small, simple, but it carried something that had not been there at the river, something that did not need to be named to be understood. She drank slowly, then handed it back, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, not pulling away as quickly as before, and when she spoke, her voice had changed, not softer, but steadier in a different way. "You should not have come back," she said, and the words were familiar, but the tone was not, the edge gone, replaced by something quieter, something that carried more weight than warning. Ethan took the canteen and secured it at his side, his gaze lifting to meet hers without hesitation.
"I
made the choice," he replied, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to explain beyond what was already clear. The hollow held that answer for a moment, letting it settle into the space between them, and Nayeli's hand moved again to the pendant at her neck, her fingers resting there as if measuring something unseen. "That pendant," Ethan said after a pause, his voice lower now, not cautious, but careful. "My mother wore one like it until the day she died." Naeli's eyes sharpened at that, not in suspicion, but in recognition that ran deeper than words, and she stepped closer. Just one step, enough to close part of the distance that had remained even after everything they had crossed. "Who gave it to her?" she asked, and this time the question was not guarded, it was searching. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a second as memory rose, clearer now than before, pulled forward by the weight of this moment. "She said it was given by a healer," he answered, "an Apache woman who found her when she was sick, alone, not expected to live through the winter." The words settled, and something in Naeli's expression shifted, something deeper than surprise, something that reached into the past and pulled it into the present without asking permission. "My grandmother," she said quietly, the certainty in her voice leaving no room for doubt. She was the healer. The hollow seemed to grow still around that, the connection forming not as a sudden revelation, but as something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, not as someone he had found in a river, not as someone he had chosen to help, but as something tied to a part of his life he had never fully understood. "Then she saved my mother," he said, and Naeli held his gaze, her voice steady, grounded. "And now you saved me." The balance of it hung between them, not as debt, not as obligation, but as something quieter, something that did not demand repayment, only recognition. Outside the hollow, the storm continued, and somewhere beyond the stone, the riders would realize the path had shifted, the trail broken, and they would begin again. But here, for a moment, that felt longer than it should have, the world held still, and in that stillness, the line between them changed, no longer divided by what they were born into, but shaped by what they had chosen to do when it mattered most. The stillness did not last, it never did out here, and it was not the storm that broke it, but something quieter, something more deliberate, a shift in the air that carried awareness before it carried sound. Ethan felt it first, not as noise, but as absence, the kind that settles when something approaches with intention instead of force. His eyes moved toward the narrow opening they had come through, his body going still in a way that had nothing to do with rest, and Naeli saw it in him before she heard it herself. When the sound came, it was not rushed, not scattered, but singular, controlled, the slow approach of one rider choosing a path with care rather than speed. Naeli's shoulders straightened, not with fear, but with recognition, and her hand fell away from the pendant at her neck as if she no longer needed its grounding. "They found the break," she said quietly, her voice steady, but carrying something deeper now, something that understood what this moment meant. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not move to hide or prepare in the way a man might when faced with something he could not outrun. He simply turned slightly, positioning himself not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, where the space between them no longer felt like a line to be guarded. The sound drew closer, each step of the horse measured, unhurried, and when the figure finally appeared at the mouth of the narrow cut, it did not enter immediately. It waited. The rider sat tall in the saddle, still against the muted light of the storm beyond, his presence filling the space without needing to move forward, and even from a distance, there was something unmistakable in the way he held himself, something that carried authority without needing to be declared. Naeli stepped forward then, not far, just enough to be seen clearly, her posture shifting, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and Ethan felt the change without needing it explained. This was not just another man following a trail. This was someone who did not need to follow. The rider dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, his boots finding the ground with quiet certainty, and for a moment he simply stood there, studying the space, the path, the two figures before him. The storm moved behind him, the wind pulling at the edges of his coat, the rain falling in steady lines, and still he did not speak. Naeli took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that her voice would carry without being raised. "Chief Tahoma," she said, the name spoken not as a title, but as a truth that did not need to be questioned. Ethan did not move, but the weight of that name settled into him, filling in the shape of what he already understood. This was the man the others followed. This was the one who decided how this ended. The chief's gaze shifted from Naeli to Ethan, slow, deliberate, not searching, but measuring, and there was no anger in it, no rush to judgment, only a quiet intensity that felt heavier than either. When he finally spoke, his voice carried low and steady, shaped by years that had taught it not to waste words. "You bring him here," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what stood before him. Naeli did not look back at Ethan when she answered. "He brought me out of the river," she replied, her voice just as steady, "when I would have been taken by it." The chief's eyes remained on Ethan, the silence stretching just long enough to make every breath feel deliberate, and then his gaze shifted again, taking in the torn edge of her clothing, the way she held herself, the small details that told a story without needing to be spoken. The weight of that unspoken story hung in the air, the same one that could turn truth into something else entirely, and Ethan knew it without being told. This was the moment where everything could be decided without a single raised voice. Naeli stepped forward once more, placing herself fully between them now, not as a barrier, but as a choice made visible. "He did not take anything from me," she said, her words clear, precise, carrying no hesitation. "He chose to save me when he could have walked away." The storm pressed closer behind the chief, the wind shifting as if waiting for something to break, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, the chief's gaze lowered, not in defeat, not in concession, but in thought, and when it lifted again, it did not carry the same weight it had before. He looked at Ethan once more, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something else entirely, something that had stepped into a line not meant for him and had not stepped back. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had not been said, everything that had been understood without words, and in that silence, the outcome began to take shape, not through force, not through command, but through the quiet recognition of what had been chosen when it mattered most. The silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough that the storm outside began to feel distant again, like something happening in another world, and in that held moment, everything rested not on strength or numbers, but on what each of them chose to do next. Chief Tahoma did not step forward, did not reach for anything. He simply stood with the kind of stillness that carried more weight than movement ever could, his eyes fixed on Naeli first, then shifting once more to Ethan, not searching now but recognizing. Naeli did not move from where she stood between them, her shoulders squared, her breath steady, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, it did not plead, it simply held. "If you judge him by what you think you saw," she said, "then you judge me by something that is not true." The words settled cleanly in the space, not challenging, not defensive, just clear, and for a moment, the wind outside seemed to pause against the rock as if even it was waiting to hear how this would end. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, his presence quiet but unshaken, because this was not his place to speak, not his place to change what could only be decided by those who understood the weight behind it. Chief Tahoma's gaze returned to Naeli, and something in his expression shifted, not softening, but deepening, as if he was looking beyond her words into something older, something that carried more than just this moment. "You stand for him," the chief said slowly, his voice steady. "Before your people." Naeli did not hesitate. "I stand for what is true," she replied, and there was no break in her voice, no doubt carried in the way she held herself. The answer did not echo. It settled. And, in that settling, something changed. The chief lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in uncertainty, but in thought, and when he looked up again, it was not at Ethan first, but at the pendant resting against Naeli's chest, the small piece of turquoise catching the faint light that filtered through the hollow. His eyes lingered there, recognition passing through them like a quiet current, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "Your grandmother gave those only to those she trusted with life," he said, and Naeli's hand lifted slightly, not to hide it, but to acknowledge it. "She gave it to his mother," Naeli said, her voice steady, "when she had no one else." The connection settled between them fully now, not as coincidence, but as something that had been set in motion long before any of them stood here. Chief Tahoma's gaze shifted back to Ethan, and this time, it did not measure him as an outsider. It considered him as something else entirely, something tied to a choice made years ago by someone the chief had known and respected. "You carry what was given to your family," the chief said, his voice calm, "and you returned it without knowing." Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. The truth of it stood on its own. The storm outside pressed closer again, the wind rising along the edges of the hollow, but inside, the space held steady, anchored by something stronger than noise or force. Chief Tahoma took a single step back then, not retreating, but creating space, and as he did, the tension that had filled the hollow did not break. It shifted, easing into something quieter, something resolved without needing to be declared. "There is no debt here," the chief said finally, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness, "only a path that is crossed and will not be forced apart." Naeli's shoulders lowered just slightly, the first sign of release she had allowed herself since the river, and Ethan felt the change without needing to look at her. The riders beyond the narrow cut would be waiting, watching for a sign, for a command, and what came next would carry beyond just the three of them standing here. Chief Tahoma turned toward the opening, his posture unchanged, his presence still carrying that same quiet authority, and as he stepped back toward the mouth of the passage, he did not look over his shoulder.
He did not need to.
The decision had already been made. The storm moved around him as he disappeared beyond the rock, and the sound of his steps faded into the larger rhythm outside, but the weight he left behind remained, not as threat, not as warning, but as something else entirely, something that had chosen not to break what could have been easily destroyed. In the hollow, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence that had come before. It was something steadier, something that carried the shape of what had just been allowed to remain whole. The hollow held its quiet long after the chief had gone, the kind of silence that does not rush to fill itself, that lingers just long enough to make a man realize something has shifted in a way that cannot be undone. Ethan did not move at first. Neither did Naeli. The storm beyond the stone carried on, steady, distant, like the world continuing its course without waiting for anyone to catch up, and for a moment it felt as if they stood outside of it, held between what had been and what would come next. Naeli was the first to step forward, slow, deliberate, her hand falling once more to the pendant at her neck, not gripping it this time, just letting her fingers rest against it as if acknowledging something that had come full circle without asking permission. She stopped a few feet from the opening where the chief had disappeared, her gaze fixed on the shifting gray beyond, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been before, not from weakness, but from understanding. "He will tell them to stand down," she said, not as hope, but as fact, and Ethan nodded once behind her, his posture easing just slightly, though not enough to lose the awareness that had carried him this far. "Then they will," he replied, simple, because out here, men followed leaders who did not speak without reason. The storm moved through the narrow cut, a low breath against the rock, and Naeli stepped out into it without hesitation, the rain catching her hair, the wind pulling at the blanket around her shoulders, but she did not stop. Ethan followed a second later, his boots finding the ground with the same steady rhythm as before, and as they cleared the passage, the world opened again, wide and uncertain, but no longer closing in. The ridge beyond held shapes now, still figures mounted in the distance, watching, waiting, but none of them moved forward. None of them pressed closer. They simply held their place, as if the decision made within the hollow had already reached them without words. Naeli walked a few steps into the open, her posture straight, her presence calm, and for a brief moment, the space between her and those riders felt like something that could have broken at any second, but did not. One by one, the figures turned, slow, deliberate, not retreating, not conceding, simply choosing a different direction, and within moments, the ridge that had been filled with quiet tension began to empty, the shapes fading into the storm until only the land remained. Ethan watched it without comment, his eyes steady, his breath even, because he understood what it meant when men like that chose to leave without being told twice. It meant the matter was closed. Naeli stood there a little longer, the rain falling around her, the wind pressing at her back, and then she turned, not toward the ridge, not toward the path they had taken, but toward Ethan. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left that needed to be proven, nothing left that needed to be defended. Just two people standing in the aftermath of a choice that had changed more than either of them had expected. "You can go back now," she said finally, her voice steady, carrying no distance, no edge, just truth. Ethan looked at her, really looked, the same way he had in the hollow, and then he gave a small nod, though his feet did not move. "And you?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a demand, just a question that held weight because it mattered. Naeli's gaze shifted briefly toward the land beyond, the place where her people waited, where her path had always led, and then back to him. "I go where I am meant to stand," she said, and there was no hesitation in it. The answer settled between them, not closing anything, not opening anything, just existing as it was. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, a gesture small enough to mean nothing to most, but here, now, it carried more than words could hold. Then he turned, not looking back this time, his step steady as he moved west again, the path he had left waiting for him where it always had been. Behind him, Naeli remained where she stood for a moment longer, the storm moving around her, the land stretching out in every direction, and when she finally turned, it was not with urgency, not with doubt, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that some crossings do not end, they simply become part of the road you carry with you. And out here, where the wind remembers nothing and the land keeps no record, the only thing that stays is the choice a person makes when no one is there to see it, and whether they walk away from it or stand their ground without a single word.